And it's so great to have you here, Anne May and Russ. This is going to be a rich hour because each of them would be a great hour on their own. You've written this wonderful book, and it is the sort of lean impact, but what inspired you was the book, The Lean Startup. Say something about whether it had the kind of impact on Silicon Valley and on business generally that we tend to think it has. And then I'm going to move to, actually, I'm going to ask you both that question because you know it from different perspectives. I'm going to start with you, Anne May.
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar with The Lean Startup, it was a book written by Eric Ries, I think about 7 years ago now, that has now, I think, become the standard Bible of Silicon Valley in a sense. And it really talks about a different way to develop products and services. And he talks about doing so under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And when you're working like a tech startup might to develop a product that's never been done before, that you don't know what's going to work and what will be effective, you need to take a different approach than you would if you're doing something that's well understood and well trodden, and that means taking a much more experimental approach. Figuring out how to accelerate the pace of learning and the pace of iteration.
Sort of learning as you go.
Learning as you go, and so it's certainly kind of what I lived and breathed during my years working in Silicon Valley, and as I moved into the social sector, something that I hope to bring with me.
And you were at Google, and before that.
I worked in Silicon Valley for over 20 years, largely in software engineering in various different roles. My last role was at Google for 8 years as a senior engineering director. But I worked at a bunch of companies like Apple and Intuit and Macromedia, as well as a number of startup companies.
Yeah. So Russ, there you are. You're teaching at Stanford at the Business School right now, having chaired the Global Innovation Fund. Clearly, your heart is both in business and in social goods, social change. Your students, are they clamoring for more information on how to have a social impact? Or are they sitting there saying, how can I make enough money to pay for my bills for having gone to an elite school for both undergraduate and graduate work?
Well, there are some of those. But I've been teaching at Stanford now for 12 years, and I've seen a big upswing in the number of students who want to work in the social sector. And I think they particularly want to work in social enterprises, that the kind that Anne May describes in her book, kinds that want to move quickly, that want to be nimble, that want to use Silicon Valley kind of practices like lean startup principles, and also that generally have some way to be sustainable. They want a revenue line. They want to create some value that somebody pays for, whether it be the recipients of the social intervention or sometimes third parties. Right. So yeah, there's a lot of enthusiasm at Stanford from students who want to do that kind of work.
So you use the phrase social enterprise. I just want to make sure we have it defined because we've got a radio audience for this. Is this a company that has both a social return and a financial return? And does it have to be market returns, or what does it have to look like?
That's a good question, and I think in the field of impact investing, that definition of exactly what a social enterprise is not super well defined, but here's my definition. It's an enterprise that is primarily mission driven. It wants to solve some social problem, wants to create some lasting impact. Now that could be a nonprofit, but it could be a for-profit. And some of those for-profits can actually try to make money. And in fact, actually there are impact investors who invest in social enterprises with the idea that they're going to get both a financial return and a social return.
Right. And of course you've got companies that, there's a phrase called shared value, companies that make the social good intrinsic to their value chain. So it's not so much that they were set up for the mission to begin with, but they want to make sure that their business practice is such that advances the social good. So I notice, Anne May, that you don't sort of take the lean startup and then write a book called The Lean Nonprofit. So instead, you're really talking about when you define the social sector, it is more than nonprofits and the foundations that support them. How do you define the social sector, the sector that's involved in impact, social impact?
Yeah, and the reason I call it lean impact is I wrote the book for anyone who's seeking to create social impact, and that can be from a nonprofit, it can be from a government, it can be from a social enterprise, and it can be from a for-profit company. It can also be from a foundation or impact investor. There's a wide range of ways that we all create impact. It can be from just individuals who are volunteering their time. But when it comes to seeking impact, I think that we let ourselves off the hook too much. Companies are expected to maximize shareholder value or maximize profits, and we hold them accountable for doing so. But I think for those of us who are mission-driven, we tend to pat each other on the back just for doing something that is good. And I think we need to raise the bar to demand that we not only do good, but we maximize the good we do with the resources that we're deploying. And so that can happen either by a nonprofit or for-profit. And as Russ says, I think more and more as I kind of was writing the book and doing my research, talking to over 200 organizations that really stood out as the most successful in delivering impact, more and more of them are sort of in this hybrid space in between where they're not just a for-profit, they're not just a nonprofit, but they have elements of both. And I feel like, the magic happens at that intersection between sectors of the public sector, the private sector, and the social sector.
And of course, you've got public-private partnerships. They try to leverage the attributes of all three. I think of Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation as almost preferring a partnership approach when they want to do something really big, like the Green Revolution back in the 70s, I guess it was. It was a long time ago. But now you've got AGRA. That's an effort at a green revolution for Africa, and it does involve all three sectors as well. Tell us, Anne May, what are the core principles of a lean startup, and therefore, and that you're applying throughout your book, Lean Impact?
Yeah, so in Lean Impact, I really distilled down three principles that really arose out of the organizations that I talked to and kind of what they found to be most successful and most helpful in helping them succeed. And they're to think big, start small, and relentlessly seek impact. And the think big part seems obvious. And Silicon Valley companies, everyone's carrying around their hockey stick graphs that they're going to reach billions of people. But in the social sector, I feel like one of the places we go wrong is in the very beginning, that we tend to, for some reason, think small. We look at the constraints we have of we have this many dollars, we have this many people, we have a grant that's the size and scope, and we say, what can we do with these limited resources we have, and what can we do within that? Instead, I think we need to start with a different premise, which is to think big, to think about the size of the need rather than the size of the constraints, and that puts us into a different mindset to start with. But then once we have that mindset, I think it's also important to start small. Like we tend to think big and then we're off to the races and start trying to execute. But where we don't have solutions that work well enough or can scale big enough, we need to start small to experiment. It allows us to try a lot more different types of approaches, figure out what's going to work and what's not, to refine what we're doing, to iterate quickly. When you're trying something with 5 or 10 or 50 people, you can iterate and learn much more quickly and much more cheaply than if you're working with thousands of people. And so starting small really is important to do that. And I think the final piece is to relentlessly seek impact. And that's really the path of how do you go from the starting small to the getting to being really big. And it requires us to maintain a focus on the metrics that matter. Too often we get driven by our emotion, either our personal attachment to a particular solution or pride of ownership, or just having done something that we see make a difference in people's lives. And so we want to do more of that rather than really looking at the data to say, is this the most effective way to get to the goal that we have? There
are times in your book where I wonder when the funder gets in the way in a number, right?
A lot of the time.
Well, it was interesting. You mentioned, choose the metrics that matter. The foundation that's made the grant may have a different set of metrics. And you may really fundamentally disagree as to whether they matter. What do you do in that situation? Is there something for foundations to learn about this?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wrote Lean Impact is because it is a lot harder to innovate in the social sector. And one of the biggest challenges that came up over and over again as I was talking to organizations is funding. Funding tends to be very restrictive, that people, whether it's a foundation or government or otherwise, tend to fund with the idea of having a very detailed design up front that often, is planned down to the penny, and has deliverables set out that you need to hit. And so it's very much a sort of planned, predictable execution model, which doesn't make sense when you're solving problems that are intractable and we don't have good solutions for yet. And it gets in the way of iteration. One of the saddest things I hear along the way is so many stories of organizations that get a grant, start doing the work, and realize that it doesn't work, but then keep doing it anyway because that's what they've agreed to do. And so instead, I think what we need is a form of funding that is more like how we fund innovation. That's either a tiered funding model or outcomes-based funding model, something that allows for a lot more experimentation and risk-taking and iteration. And that's something that I've seen some funders, some of the more progressive funders, start moving towards. I think it's something I'd love to see a lot more of. But I think it's also something that for the grant recipient, on the grant recipient side, I really encourage organizations to push back to, for example, not just accept at face value the fact that a foundation says we want you to do X, Y, and Z and just say, yes, sir, we're going to do that, but to push back a little and negotiate some room to innovate, some room to experiment, sometimes just by building in like a 5% window in a grant that says, we'll do 95% exactly what you say, but we're going to spend 5% of the money experimenting to try to figure out how to do that 95% better, because who can't do better? We know with the progress of everything we do in our lives that the world is moving at a faster and faster pace, and anything that works well today can be better next year.
And so, Russ, when it comes to venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, do they get this all in full, or is there some of the same dynamics exist there?
Well, no, I don't think they have this kind of inward looking, like, we'll tell you what to do.
Right,
No,
right.
venture capitalists sort of take a different approach, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, and I don't get me wrong, I love social sector funders, but I think they tend to be too focused on, well, they don't see the risk reward the way venture capitalists do, right? Venture capitalists, they want the big home run, and they're willing to take a lot of risk. And they know from finance that if you want a big return, you have to be willing to take big risks.
Yeah.
I don't think social sector funders typically don't think that way. They worry about the big failure. That's going to be a reputational hit. Our funders, that's not what we're set up for. And so they want to control things, and that's leads to the kind of dynamics that MA is talking about. They think small, they want to control everything. It doesn't leave any room for experimentation, and it doesn't leave any room for really shooting for the big win.
Yeah.
And it's essentially micromanaging. I mean, who does their best work when they're being micromanaged?
Yeah. So what we do in the venture capital industry, and this is one of the reasons I was excited about the Global Innovation Fund, is because they sort of take this model too, is so if you want to take more risk, you still want to mitigate that risk. Yeah. So you don't give somebody all the money up front and say, oh yeah, just we know it's risky, but just take all of it and run with it. What you do is you create these gates. They say, okay, we'll give you a small amount of money to run an experiment, which is where lean startup comes in. If you hit it and you come back and show us with the right metrics that you have, we'll give you more and we'll give you more. And that's the way to still shoot for the big win, still take risk, but mitigate that risk by gated funding.
And this is part of your saying, I mean, the way you're mitigating risk is you start small, right?
Exactly. And that's the funding that sort of goes along with the starting small. It's when you get a $50 million grant, you can't take a lot of risk with it because, you can't lose $50 million with embed it all on one number on the roulette wheel, right? But if you
as soon as we get a $50 million grant.
Well, but that's one of the problems with the social sector. If somebody's offering you $50 million, you'd be crazy not to take it. But in fact, actually, if you think the way Ann May and I think, or increasingly other people are, you might say, look, I don't want $50 million right now because I couldn't put it to good use. Yeah. I would be taking risks with your money that I don't want to. But let's agree, you give me $5 million or $2 million, I'll do this, and then if it works out, you'll give me the next $20 million. And unfortunately, that's just not how much social sector funders work.
Right. So you started, your first principle was think big, or in your book you refer to being audacious. Give us an example of a social sector entity that did well because they thought big, that it really sort of stood out to you.
Yeah. So one organization just here in the Bay Area is called EARN. It's a nonprofit that works with low-income Americans to develop a habit of savings. And they set out several years ago, kind of working in a fairly traditional way, and got to the top of their field where they were one of the largest micro savings providers in the country, had 7,000 accounts. They were getting lots of awards and recognition among their peers. But one day the founder, Ben Mangan, woke up and he thought, this is great that we're getting all these awards, except that there's 50 to 70 million people who could benefit from this in the US alone, and we're not even getting close. And so that night at an awards dinner, he stood up and he made this pronouncement that he was going to, in 5 years, they wanted to serve 1 million people. And that's a huge step from they got to 7,000 people over 10 years. Yeah. And just by, and it was his step to thinking big. But by putting that stake in the ground, it forced the organization to completely reconsider how they were working. They had been making a financial match, doing in-person visits, and that just wasn't going to be feasible if they're going to reach 1 million people. And so instead, they moved in a different direction. They built an online platform. And since the online platform came out, in the first year, they reached 85,000 people, more than 10 times as many as they did in the first 10 years alone. And so I think a lot of times if we don't set our sights high enough, we don't take up an approach that makes any sense, that allows us to get to the scope of the need.
And you certainly do see this in Silicon Valley companies. You start with an extraordinarily audacious, or at least the ones that end up being successful, so I've heard of. I'm sure there's some that were audacious and failed horribly, but but I mean, you'd argue that there's none that have succeeded that weren't audacious in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
high goals.
The space of solutions that you look for are going to be very different if you're trying to get to, 1 million people versus if you're trying to get to 10,000 people.
Yeah.
There's something very important about that too, which is particularly in the social sector, if you want to scale, the cost per intervention, meaning the cost per person you're going to help, is critical. Because if for example, if it's too costly, like the early EARN model, you're just never going to scale. You're just never going to be able to treat enough people. So if you want to deal with a problem or help address a problem that has millions or maybe tens of millions of people that you need to help, you have to be thinking about that from the beginning almost, because if you don't have the right model to scale, you're never going to get there.
Right. Now, Emma, you said that it's harder actually in the social sector, and that you were really struck by it when you moved into the social sector, moved out of private enterprise. What are the aspects that make it so much harder? Not just the funding sources, but what are the other aspects?
Yeah.
I mean, for example, one thing that hops to mind for me is that most of the problems you're trying to fix are not a single problem.
Yeah.
I mean, poverty is a system. It's an interaction among several problems. So it's not as linear. So talk about the differences and what make it harder in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons that it's harder. I thought working in Silicon Valley was hard until I tried to work on global poverty and realized how much easier it is to build apps. Funding is certainly a big issue. The restrictive nature of funding, how funding gets siloed, and so forth. It's also the other factor of funding that makes it difficult to drive these fast iteration and feedback loops is that you end up having two customers. In the business world, your customer who benefits from your product or service is also the person who buys your product or service typically. And so you have this automatic feedback loop. If you have a particular product you put out and nobody buys it, you find out very quickly that no one wants it. Whereas in the social sector, you could put out stuff that no one wants, but somebody else is paying for it, and those interests aren't necessarily aligned, and so you can be doing something for a long time without figuring out that you're not on the mark. That's another challenge. But I think there's also some innate issues in the social sector that make it harder in the nature of the problems we're trying to solve. One you mentioned is just the systemic nature of problems. We're working at the intersection of market failures and policy failures, and so the solutions are not quite so simple as one organization be able to just create a product or service and go. Impact is much harder to measure and can take much longer to realize than if you're just trying to create an e-commerce site, for example. And so trying to figure out how do we measure impact in a way that allows us to drive iteration, and how do we deal with impact that may take a long period of time to realize. And then the whole notion of experimentation, one of the things I hear a lot from folks in the nonprofit world is, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations, the whole idea of experimentation can feel feel irresponsible. And so those are just a few of the barriers, but I think there's many unique challenges to innovating for social good that come into play. And that's what I tried to write the book to address, is to really show how organizations have figured out how to navigate these kinds of challenges.
I would chime in particularly on the question of impact, because, you know, in the market economy, it's just very easy to measure what success looks like, profit. And, you know, there's a well-accepted way to measure that. You know, you get customers at the right margin and you repeat again and again. You have profit, people know that. It's way harder to do that in the social sector because, frankly, even defining impact, funders have different views of impact. Some people want what so-called randomized controlled tests, which show the behavior change and actually, you know, somebody got better or more income. And sometimes, as I may say, that could take 3, 5, 10 years. Or sometimes some people want to communicate better, but not everybody, and that's not okay with some people, and other people think that's success. So it's a super complicated and expensive thing to measure.
I was going to say, the randomized
and
controlled
that
trials.
makes everything different.
But it's also the need to build consensus. There are usually many more stakeholders. Some of them really not known to the social actor, and that need to gain buy-in at the beginning.
And many who are trying to work at cross purposes too.
Do you have example? I mean, that's interesting. Your point about cross purposes. The various stakeholders are at cross purposes. Yeah. Have you seen ones in particular, organizations in particular, that have been sort of strangled by that in the process?
There's one that comes to mind, but I think one story that might help illustrate sort of what this journey looks like, what it looks like to scale from a social sector standpoint, because it looks very different than from a private sector standpoint, is an organization called Visionspring. And Visionspring is this great nonprofit social enterprise that set out to focus on a 300-year-old invention that has been proven to improve productivity and learning potential, and that's eyeglasses. And despite this having been around for hundreds of years, there's an estimated over 2 million people or 2 billion people who need eyeglasses and don't have them. And they set out to solve this problem. And they started like any nonprofit might, where they decided to start in 2 geographies, El Salvador and India, and recruited a bunch of vision entrepreneurs who would go out to remote villages and do vision exams and provide eyeglasses to people. And they came back with great stories, people who, weren't able to work, being able to work again, kids who couldn't learn, being able to learn again. Something that most nonprofits would be very happy about is like, we're doing good, right? But, they had their sights on this 2.5 billion number and realized, they were losing money for every person they served, and they would never be able to get to that scale. And so they pivoted. They decided that wasn't good enough, and they set up these vision centers in more urban areas where they could serve more affluent populations and take the profits and plow that into outreach to more rural areas. And through this, they became financially self-sustainable. And many nonprofits would say, hey, that's a huge success. But for them, that still wasn't enough, because they realized that it would take them decades to replicate this throughout the world to be able to reach all the people they wanted to reach. And so they pivoted again. They decided to work through partnerships, and they partnered with an organization called BRAC in Bangladesh that has community healthcare workers throughout the country, this extensive network, and provided vision care through them. And through this partnership and other partnerships, they've now reached over 4.5 million people. But 4.5 million is still like tiny relative to 2.5 billion. And so their latest pivot is that they spun out something called the iAlliance. That's a public-private partnership that's really looking at the market and policy failures that are leading to the fact that people aren't somehow getting this, very cheap and effective intervention. And recognizing that the eyeglass manufacturers weren't incentivized to invest in R&D to make lower-cost eyeglasses and to get distribution out to rural areas, and that governments weren't properly providing vision care for their populations that could improve productivity of their citizens. And so they brought together this alliance that included eyeglass manufacturers and governments and nonprofits. And, as an example of one of the early successes is an MOU they signed with the government of Liberia, who has agreed now to provide vision care through their national healthcare network as well as their public school system. And so it's like starting, I think this journey of Visionspring is so interesting to me because it really shows the different levels of what it looks like to scale when you're trying to work within broken systems and you're working in a broken market and as a nonprofit that looks very different. Visionspring is still a fairly small organization, yet they're having this massive impact.
But I think there's a really important story there because, again, comparing sort of the market-oriented companies that we're typically thinking about, there's only one metric that the shareholders and probably the CEO or management care about, which is getting big and being profit. Right. But if you are in it for impact, if you're a mission-oriented enterprise, then that may not be the best way. Here's a good example. So you have to think about, like in the for-profit world, if you're out for profit, you don't want copycats. But if you're in it for impact, maybe you like copycats. Yeah.
Replication.
Yeah. If you're a for-profit company and the government basically decides that they want to get in the business of what you do, that's not good. But if you're in the mission-oriented world, then actually maybe that's exactly what you want. So you have to think about the end game quite differently.
Right. Well, I'm also I'm so glad you mentioned Brack as well as Jordan Castillo. Visionspring, he's actually lectured to your class, hasn't he?
Yes, he has, and he's the person who put iAlliance together. Actually, I just traded email with him a couple days ago. Yeah.
He's a remarkable entrepreneur.
Yeah,
but what's striking is he's one of many. I mean, in doing the research for this book, Emma, you must have really been impressed by the variety of folks out there doing really good stuff, starting with very little, except a wild dream. What you call audacity.
Yeah. No, it's amazing.
Thinking big.
We call them social entrepreneurs now. It's amazing I was so inspired by the people I got to meet, and in the process of writing the book, the funnest part was the research because I just got to seek out and talk to these amazing people who were doing this work, and felt very inspired by them. And there are people who are doing this domestically, internationally, as nonprofits, as for-profits, and yet I think I would say it's still very much in the early adopter phase. As much as that there's these people who are truly inspirational in the work that they're doing, it's still too few. There's still the vast majority of the work is still being done in a very traditional way.
Yeah. But perhaps the most important thing has happened, and that's there's been a cultural shift. Your classes, everybody wants to go to your courses. 30 years ago, if you'd said, I'm going to teach on social enterprise or social ventures, you would have been a very lonely professor.
Well, it's funny because I'm about to hit my 30-year Harvard Business School reunion, and I was thinking when I was Harvard Business School 30 years ago, I don't think we had a class on social enterprise.
No, it's so fundamentally different. The Visionspring example reminds me that one of the hurdles when you're working in the developing world is infrastructure. I mean, if they were trying to get out to the villages, to the customer that needed these classes, just getting there was an expensive enterprise. Now, there have been cases, I'm trying to remember now, because I read your book a whole 2 days ago, so I've already forgotten a couple of things. But at one point, I think you referred to a situation in which the Gates Foundation actually invested in infrastructure. Tell me, am I wrong? Are you looking at me blankly for a good reason? Yeah, I think I'm wrong.
I'm not. So I think one of the challenges, especially working in developing countries, is that you can't rely on basic things like transport, supply chains, just having talent, cold storage, and all these kinds of things. And so what ends up happening, and one of the things that makes it challenging to create enterprises in these environments is that social enterprises end up having to do it all. They end up being vertically integrated where they have to have their own supply chains, their own distribution channels, and their own sales force, and all of this kind of stuff. So it gets incredibly complicated to start an organization.
I've just gotten some question cards from the audience, and I already love the first one. The first one notes that, of course, you went from private enterprise into USAID, and I have to tell you a little story about that, but I'm first going to ask you the question. The questioner says, USAID is often considered as a big bureaucratic funder rather than a nimble, experimental one. Was this your experience, or did you see something different?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to go into USAID to be the first executive director of the Global Development Lab, and I think I think it's a testament to Raj Shah, who was administrator at the time, who set up the development lab, that they recognized that USAID was falling behind the times in being a more traditional funder, and that we needed to modernize. And so the lab was really set up to experiment with new ways of funding, and I think we did that with things like development innovation ventures. That's this tiered funding model, with the grand challenges that we had, with some outcomes-based funding models we had. And so we demonstrated that, despite all the regulations that we still had to work under, that it was possible for even a traditional government agency that's working under, lots of regulatory restrictions to be an innovative funder, that the limitation was not our regulatory environment, but rather our imagination. And so I think we were, one person who is working in the lab who used to lead our operational innovation team, I love the way he characterized this, which is that, we have this regulation manual that's like 500 pages, and really we only use about 50 pages of it. And so people have figured out how to use those 50 pages and do things a certain way. And so everyone keeps going down those same ruts in the road. But there's a whole 450 other pages, and there's a lot of things we can do that we're just not doing because we haven't figured out how to do so. And so the lab was really trying to pave those new paths for other people to go down, and starting to propagate that across the agency. And I think we've already seen some great results from that, from things like the work we did with a wide range of off-grid home solar companies. All sorts of local innovators that we were able to bring in to work with USAID for the first time. And so I think it's the beginning. There's still certainly a lot of work to be done, but if a funder like USAID can do it, I think any funder can.
Yeah. I mean, I have never seen a culture shift as dramatic in the U.S. government as the shift in USAID culture and perceptions of USAID, because it was seen as a really hard place to work, in part because Congress earmarks absolutely everything that goes into USAID. So I do have to tell you my little story. I have friends, there's a couple. He was a private equity guy. She is in a bank providing advice to high net worth individuals, and they moved to Washington for 2 years. One of them to work at USAID, and I thought, oh boy, this is going to be hard. They're going to really have a hard time. And we got together for a glass of wine, and she said, I'm in the most bureaucratic place. I just can't stand it because I'm a woman. They think I'm supposed to do their Xeroxing and get their coffee, and it's just awful. And he came in saying, I've never worked in a more innovative place. I'm just so happy. It's just wonderful. He was the one at AID. She was the one in the private sector. And I thought, if I told my friends who were at USAID way back when this story, they'd say, no way, no way. But you really did, you and Raj and others really transformed the agency and also made it customer friendly. Folks like us would go to you.
And what's exciting is I think the current administration is continuing to move that forward, and trying to mainstream some of the things that we were doing in the lab across the agency.
Yeah. No, I think what's attractive is when you bring in business lessons into an agency like USAID, then you can get bipartisan support. And Raj Shah was extremely good at never falling into a partisan trap himself. Never, saying to everyone, it's your job to serve, not to serve one party. Something.
Yeah, because getting more value for the money we're spending on foreign aid is not a partisan issue. I think that's something everyone can buy into.
Yeah. Well, in theory, absolutely, yes. So I'm going to go to another example, and that's Tom shoes, because everybody here knows about Tom shoes, right? We all have got at least one pair of Tom shoes. I think it's got a good reputation. We feel warmly about it. Their model was to give a free pair of shoes to someone in the developing world every time you bought a pair of shoes. But in your book, you say, but then again, they weren't having the kind of impact I wanted. So what was their pivot?
Yeah, so Tom Shoes is a really interesting example because I think a lot of us hear about this. I think the good news is that as a society that we have more and more gravitated towards wanting to buy from companies that are doing good, that have a social mission we buy into. And so Tom Shoes really built off that with their buy one, give one model. And they went for many years doing this and gave out something like 60 million pairs of shoes. And they started to get some criticism to say, hey, are these shoes you're giving out really benefiting people? And to their credit, they decided to find out. They ideally would have found out earlier, but they did do the work to find out. And when they went out and did a study to see what was the impact that was being made, what they discovered was that these shoes that they were giving out weren't actually improving the lives of the people who were receiving them. And in fact, in some cases, they were putting at risk local businesses who were not able to sell them as many shoes because all these free shoes were flooding in, and they were creating this kind of mentality of dependency among the populations. And so they, based on this evaluation, decided to shift their model and instead now work with local shoe manufacturers rather than dropping in new shoes, and also listen to the communities to find out what is it that they need. And it's not always shoes. Sometimes it's reproductive health. Sometimes it's vision care, and so now are really based on that kind of feedback, pivoting their model to not just have the headline that sounds good, which is you buy a pair of shoes, you're giving a pair of shoes, but really understand the dynamics of the communities that they're working in.
I think one of the lessons learned, and I give them total credit for the pivot, but is that good intentions are not enough.
Exactly.
These are complicated situations, and just because you want to help somebody and think you are, you may or may not. So you have to evaluate, and you have to be rigorous and really take the data at heart and really maybe make a different decision.
And just as a sort of addendum to that, I think an interesting comparison is Warby Parker, who also gives out eyeglasses when you buy a pair of eyeglasses. But the path that they decided to go on was that instead of doing their own distribution of eyeglasses to poor countries because they realized that wasn't their core competency, is they decided to donate money to Visionspring that we talked about earlier. And so Visionspring, that is their core expertise. They're deeply involved in these countries. They understand the dynamics. And so Warby Parker works through them to distribute eyeglasses rather than trying to do it themselves.
And that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen in the private sector, that kind of reinforcing. So on measuring, one of the question cards refers back, because you mentioned randomized controlled trials and the importance of we both talked about the importance of being able to measure and iterate. But this questioner, named Betsy, from Banantuck, has asked whether is there room to kind of push back and find better ways to measure that are easier to achieve with the kinds of funding that's available.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of a raging debate right now in the field because, I have to say, I used to be on the board of Innovations for Poverty Action, which is one of the really big RCT shops that goes and does these impact evaluations, which are expensive and complicated and usually take a long time. And there's been a pushback because people say, hey, look, we're spending a lot of money and it takes a long time. And it's a little bit counter to the kind of things that Anne May is talking about in her book, because if you want to innovate and iterate quickly, you can't really do that if you're going to do an RCT, because the thing has, the intervention that you're doing has to be pretty stable. So there's been a bit of pushback, and actually there's a new book by a guy named Dean Carlin, who's one of the RCT gurus, called Goldilocks, and that's an odd name, but it's basically recognizing the fact that there are times that you want to do a rigorous impact evaluation like an RCT, and there are times when you shouldn't. And when you shouldn't, what should you do? So there are a lot of people thinking about alternative times and methods for measuring when it's not time to do like the big RCT.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is how do you tier up to an RCT? Because ultimately, in the long run, you probably want to run an RCT or something equivalent to really understand the full scope of all the different dynamics that are at play. But what Lean Impact does, I think, is look at what are the precursors that you can start measuring first and optimize for. So, one of the examples I use in the book is like, if you're distributing mosquito nets to try to reduce the incidence of malaria in a region, it can take many years to see whether the incidence of malaria has gone down. But you can find out tomorrow whether people hung up the mosquito nets and are sleeping under them, right? And if you don't do that check in the beginning, it's pointless to wait years to find out whether, that if no one's hanging up the mosquito nets, of course you're not going to, reduce the incidence of malaria. But, this is a simple example, but in a lot of cases we don't do those early checks and we wait to run the RCT only to find out in a much more expensive, much more lengthy process that something we could have found out much easier. And not only do we need to check that people are hanging up their mosquito nets, but it's an opportunity for us to optimize that, right? So if only 50% of people are hanging up their mosquito nets, could we provide instruction manuals? Could we do like a tutorial in the village? Could we hang it up for them? Like, what are the things that we could do to get that to from 50% to 90%, so that when we do the RCT later on, we're far more likely to be successful.
And it's complicated by a few things. For one, sort of because the last 10 years have been a lot of focus on this impact evaluation and doing it rigorously. Now you have some funders who are like, well, I'm not going to give you the next 5, 10, 20 million unless you show me that you do it. So that's complicating life a little bit. But I guess from an investment perspective, I think this is a really important point. I mean, look, if we're going to have a lot of capital pour in to do something, let's say microcredit, billions of dollars of capital have gone into microcredit. It's just not like, that's not a poor thing if it didn't get the kind of social return, and it didn't actually. So if you know the history is like microcredit was supposed to lift millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's not bad, but it doesn't do that. But that happened 15 years after hundreds of millions of billions of dollars of capital moved in, and I think that's a real issue, because if the social sector really wants to help hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that is a huge opportunity cost that's been wasted. I mean, billions of dollars of capital could have potentially been employed in a different way. So I think, my view is sort of, it's hard for any one enterprise to decide exactly when to do an RCT, because of a lot of the reasons Ann May has been already articulated. But when the whole industry is about to get hundreds of millions of dollars of capital, and nobody's really done the rigorous evaluation about what the social impact is, that's a telling sign. I think people should put a big pause button right then.
So the opportunity cost that you're identifying, though, that hundreds of millions of dollars could have been used would it have been used?
That's a fair question. That's a fair question.
Because the
I don't
whole
know.
concept of being able to put some in and only get some back was kind of started with microenterprise.
Well, but see, I guess what I'm thinking of differently. See, I think when people cement it, and this is a great segue to exactly what Anna May has been talking about. See, people thought that microcredit, they were sold this bill of goods. I don't want to say it's too strong, because there was no fraud going on. But people kind of bought this idea before there was rigorous impact evaluation. If people had done an RCT before hundreds of millions of dollars went in, they would have said, it's good, but it's not good enough. Let's keep tweaking it until we get it right. Exactly. And then hundreds of millions of dollars would have gone in, because now people are doing savings programs as opposed to just microcredit, or they're tweaking that loans. And that was probably the right thing to do before billions of dollars of capital went in.
Yeah. But I think it emphasized the point you made earlier, that good intentions aren't enough. And I think we settle too much for good intentions when it comes to the social sector. Microcredit sounded like such a great idea, right?
Sure.
We give these small loans, people pay them back, isn't this great, everyone's happy. Yeah. But, just like Tom's shoes, you have to really look at what the effect actually is.
Yeah. We've been talking about incentives and disincentives throughout, and there is a worry by both funders and grantees of being really harmed by admitting that they got it wrong to begin with. And maybe I'll just turn to funders on this, because when you think about how Chan Zuckerberg, I don't think it was quite Chan, it didn't have a name yet at the point at which they made their investments in education in New Jersey, but they were really slammed when they got it wrong. I kept thinking, gee, I would not want to pick up New York Times in the morning and have all this said about me. And I did wonder whether that would make them pull back, not take any risks going forward. The Gates Foundation said, after running various tests and I guess randomized controlled trials on their education program, came back and said, our notion that small classrooms is the answer is not right. It's got everything to do with teachers, and even though it was intuitively felt right. The small classrooms would be right, at least felt right to the rest of us outside of the Gates Foundation. It is being criticized still for having gotten it wrong. And you can think, well, but wait, doesn't the sector benefit when you admit you've gotten it wrong?
But the thing that just, the best venture capital firms, 9 out of 10 investments they make are zeros, complete loss. It's the one that generates all the return.
Right.
And it's not that they admit that. They salute it. If you don't take enough risk, you're not going to lose enough, right? So I guess it really depends on what your perspective is. And when I went into GIF, I basically said to people, if we're going to have a kind of venture capital model, you're going to have to be prepared for failure.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, it was challenging. Some of those funders were like, we like risk, but we don't like failure.
And I think that the question of risk and failure, I think that we need to distinguish between big failure and small failure, because I think what we want are small failures, not big failures. I think with the Chang Zuckerberg's investment in Newark, which was $100 million, is a big investment. You can't fail with the $100 million investment. But what we did at USAID with DIV is that we made small investments of like $100,000, and we placed bets that we knew were risky, but it was only $100,000. And again, this is one of the most conservative funders on the planet, right? Because we're answerable to Congress. But I could go to Congress, and I have done this, gone up to the Hill, told them about all these things we funded for $100,000 each, many of whom failed, but these other ones succeeded. And I had no issues with it because it was a small amount of money. We failed small. And the ones that succeeded, we could kind of point to and say, and then we gave them $1 million and we gave them $5 million. And so I think that the making small bets needs to go along with the risk to allow for failure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way to mitigate risk.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you were able to do that before Congress, though, because it's so it's so easy to get very upset when when a dollar is spent of the tax dollars and it doesn't.
But if you look at all the cases where Congress has gotten upset about tax dollars being wasted, like Solyndra or whatever, it's all like big bets where we lost a lot of money. It's not these small tests. And if you if you have these small failures and you wrap it up in an overall program that also has successes, I think that most people, even up on the Hill, understand that that's a good way to go.
So as you've looked at it, we've got a couple question cards that are questions about the role of technology. And so I'm going to try to kind of wrap it into one and say, as you look at the various social enterprises and nonprofits that you've looked at that have been really successful and have come up with big ideas that have made a big difference. What role has technology played? I mean, obviously, if you start with mobile phones, it's
I was going to say. I mean, some people would argue, and people in the development world developing academic studies would argue that actually mobile phones was probably the biggest poverty alleviation tool in the last 25, maybe even 50 years. So. I don't know if it's entirely true, but there's a truth to that, and of course it wasn't mission driven, and it was profit driven.
Yeah.
I think technology is underappreciated in the social sector. One of the things we did with GIF, it's innovation, not only by technology, but part of it is technology, and there's a few things about technology that I think are very important to address social problems. One is, and I mentioned this earlier, it's important that for social interventions to scale, the costs are important, and often technology are on cost curves that drive the cost of delivery down. Another thing has to do with connectivity to people in remote places. And, I think there's a lot more technology than just mobile phones that can come along. Drones, one a good example. One of the things that's amazing about mobile phones is not just that the cost curve was low, but in vast parts of the developing world, they didn't have to invest in the infrastructure of digging lines everywhere and building the sort of traditional infrastructure. So there's huge benefits to technology, and I think it's hard because, frankly, many social sector kind of enterprises don't think about technology and don't necessarily have the people in place, the talent to actually leverage technology. But I think it's critical.
And if I can play devil's advocate a little bit, being a technologist myself, I actually think I've seen an overemphasis of technology among the social sector as well, where people are enamored with the latest technology, whether it's blockchain or artificial intelligence, and trying to find a way to use these technologies because it's sexy and funders want to fund the sexy thing. Where I've actually seen technology be the most powerful in the social sector is something that's not nearly as sexy as that, which is purely in getting the data to drive feedback loops. Technology, whether it's mobile phone, SMS surveys, or mobile-driven, data collection or sensors. Technology has allowed us to much more accurately, much more cheaply, much more quickly collect data that allows us to have some visibility into what's working or not, and that's what can speed up these feedback loops that allows us to much more quickly improve what we're doing. In the past, we were just flying blind. We would do stuff, and it'd be like decades before we realized whether it worked or not. And so speeding up that feedback loop, I think, is the biggest benefit of technology and sort of the unsung kind of impact that technology has had.
And in your book, I think you mentioned Delight, don't you? I mean, that's an organization that's trying to make technology accessible, that is made it less expensive and more accessible in places around the world.
Yeah, I mean, Delight is a different type of technology. They sell low-cost solar lanterns and sort of home solar systems, and yeah.
So am I right that that's the organization that figured out that premature babies' lives would be saved if they just had these heat lamps put on them?
I think that's a different one.
Is that a different one? Yeah, I'm confusing my Ds.
Embrace, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Embrace, yeah.
So you have a lot of reference in your book to the importance of listening, and some of the question cards have come up and said, "What about the local context? How important is it for some of these innovators to be out in the field, understanding that the contexts are different in different places?" Because sometimes I think funders just kind of think, "Well, if I triple the amount of money you have, it'll fit everywhere in the world." Is this a big issue that comes up in the world of enterprise and social change?
I think it's essential. I think one of the big mistakes we make where we aren't deploying solutions that really work is that we're not involving both the beneficiaries and the stakeholders that are involved in a particular intervention. I think it's very difficult from the comforts of a glass office in the United States, to design a solution that's really going to work in Africa or some other low-income country. And so I think it's crucial to engage beneficiaries, to really both listen to them and engage them in the process. One of the stories I tell in the book is a great social enterprise called Proximity Design that's based in Myanmar. And when Debbie and Jim, the husband and wife team that founded Proximity, decided they wanted to work with smallholder farmers in Myanmar, they picked up and moved there because they realized that if they were going to serve these communities well, they had to be as close to them as possible. And by being there, it meant that they could involve farmers in the design from the very, very beginning, when they were designing these portable, lightweight treadle pumps to pump water out of the ground to be able to irrigate their fields. They were able to bring the farmers in to be part of the design process, and as they were iterating on different designs every day, they could go out and show it to farmers, get their feedback, and iterate on it. So it dramatically increased their iteration speed, and that, as we know, is the biggest factor to success in innovation, is how fast can you learn and iterate. And being close to your beneficiaries, I think, is really important to that. And I've heard too many stories about organizations that weren't close enough to the beneficiaries and created solutions that really just didn't work in the practical realities that people lived in.
There's a set of techniques called human-centered design. It's been taught now in many universities, including Stanford, and usually it's sort of glued on to lean startup principles, because before you even start building prototypes, you want to understand the need, you understand the context, and that's what human-centered design is all about.
Yeah, and I get a lot of questions about the relationship between human-centered design and lean startup, and what I would say is that at the core, they are 100% compatible. I don't think there's anything one would say that's in contradiction to the other. Human-centered design focuses very much on value, user value? Is this something that we're delivering value to the beneficiary? It also focuses very much on the early stages of design. And what Lean Impact tries to do is create a more holistic approach that includes human-centered design, but also looks at things like impact, we've spent a bit of time talking about, and scale and growth. And so, I talk about the kind of 3 pillars of a successful social innovation being value, growth, and impact. And that you really need to optimize and deliver on all 3 for an innovation to thrive and move the needle on a problem.
Yeah. I just thought of the group I was thinking of as DREV.
Yes.
That discovered that the need for jaundiced premature babies would be jaundiced if they didn't have these lights.
There's a blue light thing.
That's
absolutely. I knew I had a D in there. Now, we have some questions about politics and local governments, and asking how important is it that you've got local government buy-in with all these efforts? And number 1, and number 2 is, and Russ, you referred to this before, government uptake. That one way to scale is to have that local government, take that program and take it to scale. Did you deal much with this in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the 2 most common paths to scale for social innovation are either market-based, which is like a business model where people are somehow paying for things, or government. And for basic social services, particularly in health and education, government is really the most viable path to scale, because that's who's spending the most money in this space. And a lot of times local governments are just not spending that money well. And so where the social sector can really play a role is being the sort of early experimenters to figure out how to do something better. One of the examples of this that I think has been really interesting to follow is in Liberia. The government of Liberia recognized a few years ago that their education system was failing. After years of civil war, after the Ebola epidemic, they just were not doing a good job educating their kids. In fact, in one year, a few years ago, 0 of the high school graduates could pass the entrance exam for college. And so, they just, to their credit, recognized that they needed help. And so they started something called the Partnership for Schools Liberia and brought in 8 different providers, some for-profit and some nonprofit, to run some schools. And they said, hey, here's the parameters. We can only pay $50 a kid a year. You have to use the government schools. You have to use the government teachers. But if you have a better way to do this, we want you to try. And they ran an RCT alongside of this. And after the first year, the results came back that almost all of the providers delivered dramatically better results. Some of them delivered a whole extra year of learning in the 1 year compared to the government schools. And so I think the jury's still out. There's some controversies around this experiment, but I think it really illustrates the value that the social sector can play in kind of being the early experimenters to try out different models. And once you find a more cost-effective way to deliver services, then government is a great path to bringing those things to scale.
I actually think this is an underappreciated thing in the sense that more social enterprises should start with the notion that their end game is that the government should take up the enterprise. So one interesting example I know is a company or a social enterprise called Possible Health. They work in Nepal, and they have a whole management and information technology framework to improve the clinical outcomes and productivity of health clinics. And they didn't go in and say, we'll start a bunch of clinics. They went to the government of Nepal, and they said, look, give us 2 or 3 clinics, and we'll run them for you. We're not going to hire our own people. We're not going to fire your people. But we'll make them better, and we'll show you better clinical outcomes, higher productivity, more patients going through. Just give us 2 years, and we'll show you the data. And they did that, and now Nepal, the government of Nepal, is using their system under their own aegis to go to other clinics. So if you kind of approach governments with this kind of, hey, we'll solve your problem, sometimes they're willing to play ball.
Yeah, and again, very different path to scale, right? It's not about your organization getting big and mighty, but it's about having massive impact.
Yeah. You're having picked a Liberian example. There's a place that figured out very early how to make sure that the philanthropy that was coming in was actually aligned with the goals of the country. They set up a secretariat within the president's office to deal with incoming philanthropists, which I thought was interesting. I mean, in fact, what happened was philanthropists went to President Johnson Sirleaf and said, look, we don't want you meeting with us. You should be able to spend your time with your constituents. Just, give us somebody to coordinate with, and don't waste your time meeting with us. But they also, part of the job was not only to coordinate what they did with the government, but to ensure that when philanthropic dollars came in, they were aligned with the economic reform plan that they had and the economic development plan that they had in place, so they weren't working at cross purposes. I'm going to close with a questioner here who asks about political economy and asks about that environment in which you're trying to achieve social good or economic development, in the case of many of these examples. But when we think about the Millennium Development Goals having been met early, that had more to do with countries opening and connecting their economies than it did with philanthropy and nonprofits and social enterprises. Do you see us now, as we're going forward to the kind of harder sustainable development goals, because all the low-hanging fruit has already been picked? Do you see as sort of a conversation between two different aspects of the world of social good, and that is between governments and between nonprofits and social enterprises, the social sector more broadly, about how to ensure that policies are friendly to development and friendly to the inputs that come from the social sector? Where does that conversation happen? Because it happens in not as direct conversation. I mean, each sector knows about what the other is up to.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important for us to work across sectors. And the new Sustainable Development Goals now, we already know that we're only 3 years in, but we already know that our trajectory is not on track to hitting the Sustainable Development Goals. The estimates are that we're $2 to $3 trillion a year short of the funding that we need to get there. And I would say that's where innovation comes in, right? That we're not going to magically all of a sudden raise $2 to $3 trillion more dollars. I think that's unrealistic. But what we should be doing is investing the money that we have more wisely, and part of it is figuring out how to get much more bang for the buck. Right. And I think it requires us to work across governments, both, high-income country governments and low-income country governments, nonprofits, the private sector, to come together and work at that intersection, because we all have a role to play. And I think these examples of, the Partnership for Schools Liberia and Impossible Health are examples of how we can have nonprofits work with governments to, and Visionspring in trying to drive government policy. I think we all have a role to play where nonprofits can really be at the forefront in figuring out, what are better solutions, and governments can be the platform to scale those solutions where they are public goods, and private sector can be the platform to scale the solutions where they are market driven.
Yeah, and I guess the other angle I would take it as that I'm hopeful that the market is going to drive some of this too. You can probably read this, but it's pretty well accepted now that millennials care more about social impact with the dollars that they're just going to come into and invest than ever before. And so, capital flows, governments pay attention to capital flows. And if capital flows into not just social enterprises, but companies that do well, that will make a change.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Russ and Anne May so much for spending this hour with us and for this wonderful book. It's really great, Anne May. So
thank you so much for having us, Chang.
Yeah, thank you.